willow science, very complicated. From traditional wicker crafts, that's how I got into it. I'm a professional academic, retired. My main interest was carbohydrate natural product chemistry, complex structures. And with retirement coming and the department closing and living in part of the time in the Donegal Celtic, I thought I should try to revive these crafts. I'm concerned about the future of the environment, get the carbon out of the air and into the things that you're going to use, cut down the plastic. So I'm trying to recruit, as the French say, vannerie sauvage, or wild foraging and basket making. So the first part is traditional wicker crafts that got me going. The bit that led me into taxonomy was at the end of the winter, the ones that were useful, the first time I tried it, and there weren't many, I thought I should propagate and find out what the species were. Now, in retrospect, this was completely the wrong way to do it, because most taxonomy, and I'll show you a few slides, is based on an idealized situation where you go out into the wild, see an evolved population, and take a representative specimen, whereas the things that people make baskets from have long been selected either casually or by cultivation, and they're often hybrids or they're complex allopolyploids. So I can branch off in all sorts of directions according to your questions. Now, I'm sure if I'm beginning to look around, if I say, are you interested in molecular biology and taxonomy, or basket making and craft work and getting out in the open air, I suspect a few of you will be biased towards that side. So I'll keep this short and sweet. Really what I say is, and what I'm looking at here, there's a little asterisk there. The two bits are actually quite antipathetic to one another, and we need to have something in between. So I'll try to say traditional wicker crafts were based on locally grown wild specimens. But as it developed, people cultivated them, had selections, and brought stuff in. And nowadays, all these old sites are more or less derelict and disappeared. And people are relying on plastic, or if they make baskets, it's stuff commercially grown in Somerset from bred versions, which aren't like the wild things. So I don't know what the trilogy would be filled in with for that asterisk. So this is the sort of scene that I was talking to you about. Yeah. Well, you can get the impression. These were old photographs anyway, so the focus wasn't very good. I can remember, like a scene at the bottom right there, oh, it's terrible, isn't it? People walked about, they never went anywhere unless they were carrying something, and the women were often knitting. So people multitasked. And what they got was all more or less homemade. So, you know, the lady there, I'm sure, I don't even know her, I think she came from Strathnagle, but it was a common scene. And everything she got on her, it was cut turf from locally, it was the firing. The creel was made out of locally grown willows, but it would have been, you know, a long selection. The rope that's got an Irish in Gaelic. This is the sort of thing. So there were no air miles involved anyway. One of the things that people don't realize is these baskets are not just from local materials, but they're made in quite a different way. So I'll come back to that later, but we'll see how we get on. The other aspect of this, people had horses and donkeys. They look as if they're adapted to carrying it, a big load, but the stuff's not very heavy. I did have a little bit here, if you've never seen turf, peat. It's the one at the right there, which is like some of these things here. Most civilizations grew grain, and they had to separate the grain and the chaff. So these are very simple weavings. Trays, and there seems to be a cult now calling them Catalan trays, but certainly in the Pyrenees they still make things like this as trays. And it's very easy weaving, but quite stylish, and you can elaborate on it. So these were ones that I made in Dundee. So we'll come back to this and you can come and look at them. I was asked to make some hurdles, so I made some A4 size ones, and there's a style to do this to keep them flat. I'll come back to all of this. these are the traditional market baskets. So if you go to the Pyrenees now, you'll see signs up. I think you can probably just about see that this basket is similar to these styles here. I did think about having a quiz and giving one as a prize, but I'll hang on to them for now. Did anybody ever go tally hiking and use a skull? No, this was 50 years ago throughout Scotland, particularly Ayrshire. This is the traditional way of doing it. The potatoes were thrown out of the rows and you walked along and put the potatoes in there. And I saw a model and it had a break in it. And I thought, well, I'll make one where I had a break, but by the time I made it, it was broken. So these are made from local materials, can be repaired, but better for burning, lighting the fire, making another one next to it. That's one of my father's time. Various other things. We'll come back to that. So I'd like you all, after I've given my PowerPoint presentation, just to do a circle around and have a look at things, handle them. This isn't just show and tell. It's hold, smell, taste if you like. Certainly, you know, engage anyway and think about trying it yourselves. Grow more willows. Biomass, short rotation coppice is going to be the field of the future, if there is any, and possibly even for manufacturing. Though the committees that I applied to would never give me any money for it. The chap on the right there, this is an old photograph and I'm sure it was set up, but he's winnowing. So this great big thing that he's got is a very flat tray. They were sometimes covered with goat skin. You've probably heard of a bowran. Bower comes from the Gaelic meaning deaf. So I think it was a deafening thing. Some people say it's not a musical instrument, but traditional musicians use this as a drum. So that was part of most civilizations throughout the world where they lived on grain. They made a winnowing tray, threw it up in the air, and the wind blew the chaff away. And that's the basis of these weaving styles there. Right. This is Occitan, Catalan equivalent. It's much more stylish. So if you can't bear the thought of walking about to Tesco's, bringing your shopping home like this. If you want to take up taxonomy, study of willows, this is still the best book. So this was written by the chap here on the left, Desmond Meikle. He's dead now, he died a couple of years ago. My parents came from Devon and Cornwall, so when I went home to see them, I'd stop at his house in Somerset and we'd have a go at, the problems of taxonomy of willows. The lady next to him took over. She's Irina Believa, a Russian lady who's been living in Britain for a long time. So I met her sort of in the same context, and she now has a garden, a willow collection in the Wye Valley, so that's also convenient for me to meet, and we have a barney about developments and the slightly different opinions about what species are and which ones are representative. She's meant to be publishing a new book, but she hasn't written it yet, and I'm sure there'll be a few problems before it comes out. I know one of already, but we haven't got time to go into it. It's to do with the naming of some of the willows, and because they're authorized names, people get upset if you condemn one that's got a name that somebody else says is not appropriate. But that's another business. So this is the two gardens where they've got huge collections. My garden is nothing like as systematic, but certainly there's some iconic specimens there. Willow taxonomy in Britain is all due to Linnaeus. And Linnaeus went out and saw the wild populations 200 years or more ago. These are his publications listed. And he was obviously quite a man who was interested in his CV and presentation. So he used to parade around in this Lapland costume. So Sweden was expanding eastwards, colonizing Lapland, trying to get there and fighting off the Russians who were trying to come this way, and it's still going on. So he would dress up like this, and I can see the point of it, because yesterday, for example, and certainly when I'm walking about the roads at home, I wear my high-vis jacket and have a hat on, and people assume that I'm approachable and know all about gardening and willows and things. And he was clearly trying to make a presentation to show that he was an adventurer on the make. Here he is camping, living in the wild. He was quite an ethnographer or ethnologist as well. So he took an interest in the Sami culture, which was considered to be, well, pretty debased. They were hardly thought of as humans by the rest. I don't know quite what all his items are, but if you look at me, look, they're a bit different, but I've got stuff tied on string. And if I was walking about, I'd probably have a basket. I suspect that this thing was his drum. I don't know what he drummed up for. It was shamanistic, perhaps. But I think he recommended this to his students. I don't know if any of them ever took it up. Loose-fitting attire, waterproof and locally produced. This is the fashion. So the binomial nomenclature, which we attribute to Linnaeus, and 17 of them are still ones that he identified in this book, out of about 20 that we have as being willows. Now, my problem at the beginning was saying, what is the correct taxonomy, the critical taxonomy of biodiversity? Should we be using names of species and say they're the same as the ones here, which are clearly evolved to suit Lapland? Well, they may be, but they must be slightly different, at least at some subspecific level. And I think this is one of the points I would like to get over, that we must not, when you're sort of reforesting somewhere or other, just put it out to contract to supply plants of the species which were recorded there, and they'll ship stuff in that was mass produced from, say, the Netherlands by some commercial. It must be locally produced from local stock, preferably of seed. I mean, you can add other things as well if you think you want to get ahead of climate change. But really, the problem is that we don't have an official nomenclature for ecotypes, for the adapted thing, partly because we don't know what they are, but they're there. Anyway, this is the start of nomenclature. These are the species. I've got 2 or 3 of them there, but certainly not all of them. They're still our main species, but I'm sure our types are different. So Desmond Meikle, who wrote this book, came to a conference here in 1992. Were any of you at it? I don't see anyone who might have. No. It was organised by Roy Watling and another old chum of mine, John Raven, who lives in Dundee still. And Meikle came, and he said these are 3 problems that he knew of and was prepared to admit to. He was a rather quiet, modest man, and I'm sure if you pushed him, he might say there are other problems, but this is what he volunteered at the end of his life, really, when he had written his book, and never did anything more about it as far as I know. So widespread occurrence in Perthshire and neighbouring counties of the intermediate between Salix mercenifolia and Salix filicifolia. This is it had another name, it's the dark-leaved or blackening nigricans type, and these are hexaploids. So they got very complicated epigenetics and sort of plasticity rather than variety built into them. They have variety and variation of a genetic type as well. Salix filicifolia is the tea leaf one, and it has a very peculiar, isolated, distinct habit, as far as I know, that it only grows in very extreme, rocky, inaccessible places, usually quite wet and exposed. And I think the reason is that mercenifolia, the blackening one, and this is one of the tests that I've developed, is also resistant to forage. So animals, insects, and other things don't eat it. Some of them eat it and produce a repellent thing, whereas the other one doesn't have this, so it can only survive properly in these most inaccessible places that aren't grazed. And I suspect that what he's talking about there, he says this intermediate of hybrid origin is not so much as an intermediate, it's just the sort of mobile form. And once they settle down in one area, selection kills off either the mercenifolia part or the other one, and they evolve back over time into ones that are more like the extreme. So part of the problem with nomenclature is this thing that he doesn't mention. It's called cross tetrapla, usually named by Walker, a Scottish gentleman of 18th century. This thing might as well be called the species, and these are extremes. Do you increase biodiversity by giving all three of them names? Killing the one in the middle and saying they're not all the same, so you've only got two? How do you measure effectively biodiversity? I don't think by calling them hybrids. You're really sort of attracting attention and saying that this is an important taxon, whatever its name is. I think we really need another nomenclature. So intermediates, which are not necessarily hybrids, but continue by self-perpetuating breeding and traveling, you know, they are the R and K differentiations of a hexaploid range, a continuum. Anyway, I can rattle on about that and we go on from there. The British sallows were two common aggregate species, so he's saying aggregate is a problem. Cinerea, and I know I've had this out with some of you, has been split in here and still in the BSBI database into either subspecies or varieties. And the rusty one, which is the Lusitanian Atlantic form, was favored by Brotero, who fled the Inquisition in 1804. He published his Flora Lusitanica. That is the more westerly type we have. And the Cinerea L, the Latin one, is our type, which is actually most common around here, but particularly in Norfolk, the Fencar species is probably the one which is really the true Cinerea, similar to the Swedish ecotype. Similar things apply to Caprea. We have a Highland one, which may or not be the same as the Swedish one. It's the English one that needs a different name. It looks quite different. Again, this is a third one. The eared willow, Salix aurita, may also comprise segregates. I don't know what he meant quite by that, but I've certainly seen ones. And they're tetraploid and diploid, and it may be that they've got different morphology, different habitat requirements. I'm not going to pursue that today. They all hybridize as well between themselves, and it's a problem to identify. The last one is still ongoing. So he favored the naming of a species called Salix fragilis, the crack willow. When Irina, whose picture I showed you, came along, she knew about some of the Russian species, which actually were populations, but she didn't collect from them. And the place where they came from, Meikle suggested it was in a region, the Pontic region, at the east end of the Mediterranean. So Euxina was a tribe who were, meaning favorable foreigners. But I think all this is going to collapse and we're going to revert back to fragilis for complicated taxonomic reasons. Okay. I put in a little bracket there, vis-a-vis hybridity with Salix alba. I'd like to know, which trees any of you recognize. I was walking to the gardens today. You have some lovely Salix alba, great big columnar trees over by the pond, but I couldn't see any crack willows. So when this is resolved, perhaps we should have a crack willow for comparison planted. I was surprised recently by the interest in the sycamore gap tree when it was cut down. People suddenly realized they missed it. I think we need something north of Hadrian's Wall. There's a few iconic trees. And Walker, who named Salix tetrapla, certainly he was quite keen on saying which ones were the giant trees that were around that we should look after. They grow at a terrific rate, and they're often not old, but some of the coppice ones may be over 100. But think about the trees that you would be sorry to miss. I particularly favor goat willows because everybody hates goat willows. Foresters have no use for them. They grow everywhere as seed. People like pussy willows, but they don't want a great big thing. So they grow the Kilmarnock variety, which is weeping. And there are problems with that, which I'll deal with. Maybe not today. We ought to have some iconic wild species in our gardens for people to see. Unfortunately, none of them are much good for making things, but my father made handles for his shovels out of goat willows, so there is a use. And in fact, even the Bowran drum, the outer bit was made of goat willow, I believe. Whether it still is, I don't know what the acoustics are. I'm setting many hairs loose here, and I would like to hear your opinions and discuss them. So I will open it to discussion, and I would suggest at the same time you can come and look at some of these things, and I'll give a little talk about the manufacture.